So let's go ahead and build this photo booth clone in some JavaScript. The first thing we want to do is we're going to create a directory on our desktop. And you guys hopefully can see that. Okay, it's very small text in the top right corner there. All I'm doing is I'm just changing the directory to my desktop, making a directory called photo booth clone. And I'm changing into the photo booth directory, and I'm going to open that in Sublime. That's all I did. Now I have an empty folder in Sublime called photo booth clone. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this index.html. And I'm going to create another file, and I'm going to call this one main.js. And then I'm going to create another file, and it's going to be called, anyone guess? styles.css. These are the only 3 files we need to get our application going, and the CSS file is actually optional. Inside index.html, we're just going to create our basic document. We're going to call it photo booth clone. Save that, and now we're going to go ahead and deploy this on our lovely little server. Now I want you guys to be able to follow along with me as much as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stream this online so you can actually access the page that I'm going to be viewing for debugging purposes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Python HTTP server, and then I'm going to put this online for you guys. And hopefully this works. Let's go ahead and see if I copy this, put it in the browser. Boom, photo booth clone is online. So if you all can go ahead and go to this link here, webdev1234. I'm out of ideas here, guys. And if you can go ahead and paste this URL in your browser bar, you should be able to follow along with me as I code. So I'm going to give you all a second, webdev1234. Is everybody good? Awesome. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this on another screen so we can kind of look at that later. Okay. Now that we have that going, let's do h1 photo booth clone. All we're doing here is we're just creating a heading tag, right? So when we refresh, we get photo booth clone. And when you refresh on your side, it should also show photo booth clone. Am I crazy or is it working? It's working? Awesome. Okay, so let's get to the fun stuff. In order to capture input from our camera, we need a couple ingredients, all right? We need a couple ingredients. The first thing is we need to actually make sure our JavaScript is executing correctly, right? And right now we haven't even included it on the page, so we're going to go ahead and do that first. So we're going to create a script tag at the top. Source is going to be, make that a little bit bigger for you guys. The source is going to be main.js. And inside main.js, we're going to say alert, hi there. And we're going to refresh in our browser, and it should say hi there, which means we are game. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, we're going to want to make sure we wait until the page is finished loading before we execute our code. And a lot of you have probably seen the whole jQuery or the whole document ready function thing, like in jQuery. We're going to do all of this in vanilla JS, so we're not going to touch any frameworks whatsoever, so we can demonstrate the true power of the force, of WebRTC, okay? So the way that we're going to start this off is we're going to create a function that is going to be executed immediately when the browser renders this, right? So if I put alert hi, and then I run this startup, and if I immediately say startup, it'll just call this function the moment I load the browser, right? The browser page. So what we want to do is we want our startup function to contain all of the main code for linking up our video camera and showing the video on the page, right? Those are like the main things that we want to set up. So to make sure that happens and to make sure we have access to the document object model, which is the HTML, the fancy HTML that you see in here, we need to make sure that this page is finished loading before we actually execute our JavaScript. So the way that we do that is we add an event listener to the window object. Window is like the browser window. We're going to add event listener. Let me just change this to Babel real quick. All right, window.addEventListener. And we're going to wait for the load event. The load means that it is finished loading, so everything's ready for us. And then we're going to pass it a reference to a function that we want to call when it's done loading. And that function is startup. All right. So now, does anybody have any guess when I refresh this in my browser, what's going to happen? Hi. All right, let's go ahead and refresh. Boom, hi. And the difference between this hi and the previous hi we had was this is waiting for the entire page to finish loading before executing. All right. So now that we have the pleasantries out of the way, let's go ahead and add support for our video camera, which is what we're really here for, right? So the WebRTC API allows us to connect to input devices, all right? And these input devices are called user media. And by user media, I mean camera, microphone, maybe if you have two cameras and you're fancy, right, a front and back facing camera, like choose the back camera instead of the front camera, and even screen sharing. So your desktop itself is you know, an input source, which is really cool. So you can do screen shares and things like that with no problem at all. So the way that we can access this is through something called Navigator, get user media. This is the magic function that allows us to access our camera. All right, so navigator.getUserMedia, great. How can we actually use that? It's a method that we can call, and inside the method, we can pass it three things. All right, so there is a constraints thing that we need to pass in, which are a bunch of options. We have a success, like when we're able to grab access to the camera, or when there is a failure, meaning the camera was broken, you know, somebody spat into it and like shorted out the circuit, something like that, right? That's a failure event. It means that something happened. We should probably tell them we couldn't find your camera or something like that, or maybe it doesn't exist, right? So these are the three things that we need. So the first thing, when we say constraints, what are we talking about? We're talking about, do we want audio? Do we want video, right? We could do a purely audio call, right, or a pure video call. In our case, since we're just, taking pictures of ourselves, right, so that we can post them on Instagram, all we care about is the video component. We're not going to take audio. So we're going to say video is true, audio is false. That's literally it. We now tell it we only want the video, we don't care about the audio. All right. So for our success, so when this worked and we connected to our video input, we have a function that we can execute that will give us a stream object. This is a media stream object in the JavaScript spec, and the media stream object basically has all the information for the video that comes out, all right, from the camera. And it does a lot of hocus pocus in the background to get this to work. All that we need to know about is that, hey, we have a reference to some video that's going to be playing live, okay? So inside this stream, if we think to ourselves, how are we going to access this stream, right? We can do something like console.log stream to see how that looks like. So if I refresh and I open the inspector, Command Option I on a Mac, we can see that it says failure is not defined, right? Because we didn't finish this. So let's go ahead and add the function for failure, error, console.warn error. So now when we refresh it, it should say, okay, navigator.getUserMedia is not a function. Oh no, what did we do wrong? Well, we actually didn't do anything wrong. The problem is that the WebRTC spec is too new, so nobody has decided on a standard yet. So what this means is, just like in CSS, you have vendor prefixes for things. In our JavaScript, we need to tell it, oh, if getUserMedia doesn't exist, try the WebKit version, try the Mozilla version, right? Something like that. So we need to be able to tell it which one to call depending on what browser it's using. The beautiful thing about JavaScript is it basically gives us no coalescing for free. No coalescing meaning it's able to skip a value if it's blank and just go on to the next value until it finds one that's not invalid. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing here. And this is actually the fundamental principle behind a lot of things like shims, things that like fill in features that aren't available in older browsers. So what we're going to do here is actually the fundamental for making your own shim. So what we're going to do is we're going to say navigator.getUserMedia, because getUserMedia is what we want to use in the end, right? That's the standard that will happen eventually, right? So getUserMedia is going to be equal to, so let's go ahead and actually let's see, let's just put that down there for now. So what we want to do is we want to say navigator.getUserMedia is going to be equal to navigator.getUserMedia, or it's going to be equal to navigator.webRTC kit get WebKit get user media, or it's going to be navigator.mozilla, which is Moz, get user media. So this way, it's just going to keep finding, it's going to keep going through the list until it finds one that's valid. So after we set that, we can now use navigator.getUserMedia and call that method, right? Now, the problem is it's also possible that we have a browser in which this is not even a thing. Like all three of these things fail right here. So it doesn't know what any of these are. So this means we're probably in IE. If in doubt, blame IE, right? So if that is the case and this browser totally sucks, we can say if navigator.getUserMedia, right? If there's nothing set, it's just going to be false, right? When we do the when we try to evaluate this. So we want to make sure we only execute this code if it's able to find the get user media, if it's set to something valid, right? So we're going to go ahead and paste it inside this if clause here, just so we can avoid any weird nastiness and people complaining, right? Okay, so now that we have this set up, let's go ahead and go back to our site and tentatively press the refresh button. And all of a sudden, you should see this notification that pops up in the top left corner that says, I want to use your camera. Now, unbeknownst to you guys, I actually already wrote some code. So when you turn on your cameras, I'm actually like recording everything and uploading it to like a live Twitch. I'm not actually doing that now. Okay. If you say allow, right? See, but this is a use case. What if I'm a nefarious guy and I post an ad, you know, on some site, and then all of a sudden I'm quietly recording everything that you do on the internet? That is creepy, right? So instead, we have this security permission that says, this guy wants to use your camera. Do you trust him? I hope you guys trust me. If you don't, that's okay too. But do you trust him? If you say allow, suddenly I'm going to be able to see what you see, right? So you press allow. If you guys followed through on your computers, you should see this little glowing orb, this luminescent orb in the top left corner here. And that means it's recording your video. It's taking video from your camera. And if you have, like my webcam, I have like a little green dot that's glowing next to it. You should also see that on your Macs. If you have Macs and Windows, you know, who knows? But on your phone too? Yeah, there we go. All right. So this is pretty cool, right? Cross-platform, we have access to your video camera. Now, this isn't very exciting because guess what? I don't know if it's actually working, right? I could be lying to you for all you know. So we're going to go ahead and prove to ourselves and add a little bit more functionality. So in the HTML5 spec, there is this fantastic new tag called video. And this video tag allows us to, guess what? Stream video from a variety of sources. So you can pass it a URL or an MP4 or an OGG file, something like that, and it's just going to play it in the browser. It's going to give you some controls, right? For the longest time, Adobe Flash dominated the whole video streaming place because nobody could figure out a good way to do it that was standard, right? So everyone's like, oh, just download the Flash plugin. And until recently, even YouTube was using Flash for most of its videos. It still does for fallbacks. But now YouTube has transitioned over to HTML5 video. So when you go and play the Force Awakens trailer for the 250 billionth time on YouTube, you're actually using the power of the new HTML5 video tag. So we're going to also leverage this power with great responsibility. And we're going to tell it to point at the video stream that's coming from our cameras instead of from some random place on the internet, all right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to go back to our index.html file. And inside our index.html file, we need to create a video tag. And HTML is really simple, right? So to create this video tag, all we need to do is type in video as a tag. And we don't care about the source right now because we don't really know what that is outside of JavaScript. So we create a video tag on the page. We save that. And we could even put like a style thing in here just to make sure it works. Width is like 500 pixels, height is 500 pixels. We could do something like that just to prove to ourselves that it works. Background, color, red. So just to prove that it works, because we don't actually have anything playing in it right now, right? So I'll give you all a little bit of time to write that down. And now I'm going to go ahead and scroll back to our browser window, refresh, and you'll see this big red thing here, right? So this is where our video will show up eventually. Trust me, right? So that's where our video is going to show up eventually. We can also do some things like we can add controls. So all I did was I just put in an attribute called controls. And when we go back to our browser, you see it has a play button, it has like a volume control, and the current elapsed time of the video, right? There's no video yet, so everything's grayed out. But you can see the potential, right? We're just going to stick our faces in there, right? Okay. So let's go ahead and remove all of this nonsense and just keep the video tag. Now, we want to access this video tag from our JavaScript because our JavaScript is driving this whole shebang, right? So for the sake of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and use IDs to select everything. Now, normally this does not lead to the best web applications, but for the sake of the simplicity of the demo, I'm gonna do that here. So we're gonna add an ID to our video. Again, an ID is a unique identifier that should only exist once in an HTML document, and you can use it to reference, some element, right, specifically. So the ID for this video, we're gonna call it, what should we call this? This is gonna be where our face shows up, right? So this could possibly be the selfie cam or something like that. So let's call this a selfie-cam, all right? So we have a video called selfie cam. Now let's go back to our JavaScript file, our main.js file, and we should maybe reference this video file somewhere in our JavaScript code. So to point our JavaScript to this video tag in our HTML file, what are we going to do? Well, in our startup, because we had the foresight to add this event listener to wait until the HTML is finished loading, we can access it using let's create a variable called maybe the selfie cam, and selfie cam, and this is going to be equal to document because all of our HTML that we can access exists in our document, right? Just like in our Word document that we talked about before. Document.get element by ID, and the ID that we're going to pass it is, big surprise, selfie cam. So what this will do is this will grab a hold of that HTML element, and it'll allow us to view the properties and manipulate it to do whatever we want. Now, just as a side note, we can also do something else. We could also do query selector, and then we can use the CSS selectors to select the same thing. But for now, I'm just going to use get element by ID since we don't need to do anything complicated, right? Just grab the ID and be done with it. All right. So we grabbed the selfie cam. We are now able to access all of its properties. Make it play stuff if we want to, right? All these cool things. So if we go down here and we say, okay, cool, navigator.getUserMedia is now going to be set to whatever the browser choice, wants. And then if the getUserMedia thing is available to us for usage, we're going to start the video streaming. We're going to grab a stream, and if there's an error, we're going to spit out an error. So once we've started and established a stream, we can use this stream object to attach it to our video, right? So let's go ahead and go back to our browser. And when we refresh, you notice that we console logged the stream. So if we go ahead and expand this, I know it's really hard to see, so I'm going to try to make it, make it a little bit bigger. If we go ahead and inspect the media stream, it has a ton of crap in it, right? So active, true, right? Because it's actually using my camera right now. Ended is false. It has some ID, right? It has like a bunch of stuff in it, right? So we can use this. We can use this ID. This ID is like uniquely referencing the stream that exists in memory in Chrome somewhere, right? In the low-level C++ implementation. We can use this and stick it into our video somehow, okay? So the way that we can do that is we can go ahead and remove the console thing, and we can use a singleton object. A singleton is like something that can exist only once in an application, right? You can't make a new instance of it. You're going to use a singleton object to convert the stream into a data URL, into a URL that we can pass to our video. If we go back to index.html, the video takes in a source. This source is, http example.com/something.ogg, some file, right, that we can stream. And it gives us all the streaming capabilities for free. So what we want to do is we want to convert our video stream into some URL format that our video can understand, right? So we're going to go ahead and remove the source again. And inside main, we're going to say window, because window also has some cool functions in it that we can use, .url, okay, .url. And this allows us to access something called create oh shoot, I actually forgot. Let's see, what is it called? This is when documentation is helpful. So we can go JavaScript and window.url. What do we have available? Create object URL. Excellent. That's exactly what we want. So window.url create object URL. And guess what? We pass in the stream that we have. We pass in the stream that we have. And this will give us a stream URL, which we're going to remember in this variable here. Okay? All right, I have some good and bad news for you. The good news is this will work sometimes, and the bad news is it won't work sometimes. So the reason is the window URL spec is also in flux. So some browsers will use window.url and other browsers will use WebKit URL. All right? For the same reason that WebRTC is very new and it's changing a lot. So we're going to do something very similar to what we did with navigator.getUserMedia. What we're going to do here is we're going to say window.url is going to be equal to window.url or window.webkit URL, because WebKit is using a non-standard version of that. And I believe if we go back to our documentation, it will actually mention that in this living standard document somewhere. And it says in the footnote that implement under non-standard name WebKit URL for Chrome and for Safari and for Opera. So again, MDN, the Mozilla developer guide, is fantastic. So you guys should definitely check that out. So we need to use WebKit URL for WebKit browsers, which we've done here. So now that we have quote unquote normalized this into something we can just use window.url and then create the object stream here. So before we continue, let's go ahead and do a console.log and let's log that stream URL to our console, or developer console. And once we've done that, we're going to scroll over to our web page, refresh, and boom, we'll see that we have this blob, HTTPS, ngrok, blah, blah, blah. It has like some weird, UUID, unique, universal identifier, right? In here, this is the unique resource that is corresponding to our live video stream. Okay, so now we just need to pass this. This is a nice handy HTTPS string. We can pass this into our video URL, and we should bring forth video. Okay, so let's remove the console.log here, and instead let's do selfiecam.src. src is the source attribute, and we're going to set that. We're going to set that to our stream URL. Okay. So now let's go ahead and refresh that in our browser and see if anything happens. Ooh, I don't know about you, but I see something that looks like a face. Now, it's not really updating because I'm pretty sure I'm not looking at the camera right now. I'm looking at you guys, and this sucks. Like, did we hit a bug or what? What the hell happened, right? So the cool thing is when you go to YouTube and you start browsing through all the videos, do they play by default? Except the one that you have currently open, right? All the ones on the side, they don't play by default, right? If all the suggested related videos on the side of YouTube played by default, I don't think anyone would use YouTube. Okay, the notable exception to this, of course, is the Facebook timeline, in which case it just autoplays everything. Okay, but we don't, by default, usually you don't want users to be aggravated because all these videos are playing automatically. So the default behavior is to load the stream, but request that the user press play before it plays. Okay, so we need some way of telling the video to start playing immediately once it sets the URL, right? Oh, okay. So now that we have our plan of attack, we're going to look at this and squint at it very hard and wonder what we can do to make this play. So selfie cam, we already said, is pointing to that DOM element, right? The document object model element in our HTML. And that element is actually a media object that has certain functions associated with it. So one of them is play, and one of them is pause. So we can use selfie cam, because we already have a reference to it, selfie cam.play. We can execute that method immediately. And now when we refresh in our browser, boom, It's playing. It's pretty cool, right? Okay. Okay, so what have we done so far? We have quickly enabled video access. We scanned to see whether the user can actually access his camera or not, or her camera. And then if the person allowed the permissions to go through and say, yes, please access my camera, it will get a stream. We convert the stream, which is a blob, a data blob, into a URL that the video tag can reference. So now the video tag is pointing to this URL that it understands, and then we tell the video to play immediately. So what we're doing is pretty cool, guys. We're actually like live screencasting ourselves. When YouTube, when you say the live screen share feature, right, and you're able to like go around the place and have live commentary and people can watch you live, that's basically what you're doing. You're streaming it from your device into the interwebs, in this case just locally, right? And then you're immediately playing it back. So that's pretty cool. So the next part, the next step is we want to be able to capture that video. We want to capture one of the frames in that video, and then we want to, what? Show it, as a still, right? So then we can save it to our computer or do something, funny with it later, right? So how do we do that? Well, let's see. We have already said we're going to play the video. We maybe the first step is to think about the GUI, right? The graphic user interface. What can we do to enable this feature? I would argue buttons are probably a good place to start. So we're going to go ahead and add a little button that when we press it will theoretically take a still image from our live video stream, right? So we're going to go to our index.html file, this elaborately complicated mess of code that we have here, and we're going to add a button. And I'm going to use the HTML5 button. Now, we could just say take picture or take selfie, something like that. Save it. And when we go back to our browser and refresh, there will be a button that says take selfie. Cool. Okay, I honestly hate this button. It's really small. It doesn't look great. And I have to look around for it. It's like in the bottom right-hand corner, like what gives, right? So we're going to make this a little bit nicer for ourselves. So instead of using a take selfie like this, I'm actually going to remove the text, and I'm going to use a icon pack called Font Awesome. And if you guys haven't used Font Awesome before, you should, because it is awesome. Okay. I've gone ahead and I've already gotten the link for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and include this in the document header here, like that. Now, if you want to follow along on your own, if you go to the ngrok page that we set up earlier, you can inspect the source, and I'll do that right now. You can refresh. Oops. You can refresh, go to the Elements tab, and at the very top in the head section, you will see this link, and it has the Font Awesome thing in there. And then you can right-click on it, and you can say copy. And when you copy it and just paste it into your own Sublime window or whatever, you will have access to that. Okay. So we now have Font Awesome installed, right? Or quote-unquote installed. It's included. We can access it with the I tag. And inside the I tag, you actually don't have to use the I tag, but it's semantically really nice. I'm going to add a class to it. And I'm going to do FA for Font Awesome. And then FA camera. Okay? So Font Awesome FA camera. So what this does is just creates a camera icon and sticks it in there without me having to go and make it myself in Photoshop or Illustrator or go online and grab an image from the internet. If we refresh this, you'll see it's still very small, it's still very tiny, but you can see there's a little black camera in it. Now the beautiful thing is this is actually like a web font. So these are icons that are fonts. So that means we can specify the color and we can change the size and it's going to stay the same sharpness. So since this is a button that we're probably going to click at some point, maybe we should also give it an ID so we can reference it later and react to things like clicking. So we're going to give it an ID as well, and we're going to call it Take Selfie Button. All right, nothing fancy. And we're going to go ahead and copy that name, that ID, and in our main.js file, remember this startup function only executes after the window has loaded all the content, right? So somewhere in here, let's say at the very end, we're going to add an event listener. So we added an event listener to the window before. Now we want to add an event listener to a button, right? But I'm actually getting ahead of myself because we haven't referenced the button. So what we're going to do is we're going to do comma, and I'm just going to specify another variable, and we're going to call it take, what was it called? Take selfie button, document.getElements by ID, take selfie button, right? So now we have access to that document element as well. Fantastic. Okay, so if we go to the very bottom of our file here, we can now create an event listener for that. So take selfie button dot add event listener. Click is the event that we want to listen to, and we want it to have some function that reacts to the click. So what should the take selfie button do? It should probably take a selfie, right? So maybe we can call our function take selfie. So we're going to call it, we're going to make it execute a function called take selfie, and we're going to create a function outside called take selfie, like that. Has everyone got that? And inside the take selfie function, because we are fans of what, test-driven development, so to speak. So we're going to make sure that this function is going to be working before we continue with the rest of our app. So I'm going to just say alert, I took an awesome selfie. Give me $. Okay. We go back, we refresh the page. Video pops up, that's cool. We press on the little button and it says, I took an awesome selfie. Okay, so we know it's working now, right? So cool, events are great. Okay, now I know this is not a CSS talk, but that button is just horrible, okay? I can't see it, I can barely click on it, and I don't even know how that's gonna look on a mobile device, okay? So we're gonna go into our style.css, which is blank right now, and we're gonna enter some styles for our button. So our button was take selfie button, and just as a little bit of a I guess, warm up. Remember, we have two main types of selectors that we use almost all the time. Dot means class, and the pound sign means ID. So we're going to use that to select the ID that's called take selfie button, and then whatever we put in here is going to paint on top of that button, right? So the first thing that we want to do is we want to set the border to none, so it gets rid of the default borders that it has. Then we want to set the font size to something appropriately large. Let's say 30 pixels for now. And a padding of maybe 10 pixels, and color to white. And then the background color, we can maybe say blue for now or something like that, right? And if we go back to our index.html file, you'll notice that we never really bothered to include the link, the CSS file in our HTML. So we're going to go ahead and add that really quickly as well. So link rel style sheet. The href is the location of the styles.css file, so styles.css. And now we are golden, right? We are golden. So we have included our style sheet. If we go back to the main page and refresh, the button is now blue and it has a camera icon in it, right? Much more clickable, much nicer. It still looks ugly to me though. So I'm just going to really quickly, again, this isn't about making it look nice. I'll show you a version that looks nicer later. But we're just going to go ahead and pick, a color that looks a little bit more friendly. So maybe something a little bit more blue, like that. We're just going to copy this. And I don't know if you guys want to copy it down, but this is the hex code 1687FF. And we're just going to change the style background color to that. And we're going to add a border radius of 50%. And what this is going to do is it's going to make our button a circle. So now this looks kind of like the what? It looks like the Google action buttons, right, in Lollipop. Okay, that's cool. Now we want to move it down maybe, because when we take a picture, it probably should be below the video, right? So really quickly, if we go back to our index.html, we see we have a video and then we have a button. We're just going to go ahead, because again, this isn't a talk about HTML or CSS. We're just going to put a BR tag in there for now, and we'll get back to that later. So we add a BR tag. This is break. When we refresh, the camera button is now below. One more quick thing. we're just going to go ahead and say, okay, fine, in our style.css, I'm going to just add a quick thing to the body. Just for now, we're going to say text align center. Text align center to the body will just make everything on the entire page centered. That's all it does. So if we go back and refresh, everything will be in the middle of the page. It's a little bit more tolerable, right? And then the button is in the middle as well. So this looks a little bit cooler. And of course, these were all stylistic changes. So if we press the camera button, it doesn't affect the logic that we have in there, right? Cool. So now we are ready to continue. At least it's a little bit more sane, right? A little bit nicer to look at. We're going to continue and capture a still frame from our video and convert it to a picture. Okay, so let's go back to our main.js file. Let's travel back over there, and let's revisit this take selfie button. We've probably all deduced that this alert is totally useless, so we're going to remove that, and we're going to replace it with something else. So when we take a selfie, we probably need to know about our video data, right? We probably need to know about the URL stream thing that we did for our video, because maybe we can use that to convert it into something else, right? So we can think about that for a little bit, and we'll come to the realization, this is the abridged version obviously, we'll come to the realization that what we're trying to do is kind of weird, because we have a URL, an image does take a URL, right? But it takes a URL of a picture, it's a static image. A video takes a stream of moving video, of a bunch of pictures streamed together. So video encoding is basically just a way of efficiently compressing a huge sequence of pictures and playing them back at a frequency that it looks like it's moving, right? So we need a way of capturing one of those frames out of it and converting that stream into something that we can understand. Thankfully, we don't have to do any math, because our good friends at the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, came up with a whole standard for this so that we don't have to worry about it, okay? Now, this does lead to a weird thing. In HTML5, there is a new element called the canvas. The canvas is used for allowing you to have raw access to on the page that you can paint over, like you can specify pixels to paint over, and there are a couple different contexts, a couple different modes that you can draw to this canvas. So if you go online and you see a lot of these photo editors and then you're drawing using a paint tool and you're drawing over an image, what it's doing is it's saying I have some array and I'm painting all those pixel values onto this canvas, and then when I draw, when you see the event of the mouse clicking on it, it's going to change the pixel value to red or something like that. And that's how quote-unquote painting works. So what we want to do is we want to use the canvas, which already exists, to manipulate images in a raw form, and we want to grab that still from our video. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to go ahead and create a canvas first. So if we go back to our index.html file, we're going to add another, and we're going to call it a canvas. And let's give it a descriptive name. So the ID that we're going to give it could be something like image processor. So this canvas is going to take our image, or take our video, and we're going to be able to save it to an image file that our image img HTML tag can actually use to render a picture onto the page. Okay, now that we have our canvas, we actually don't want to see what's on the canvas. We want the canvas to be hidden from view, so that when we're rendering our elements or when we're rendering our pictures, it just kind of does it in the background. It's basically like a helper method, right? That you can think of it like that. So inside our styles.css, we're going to aggressively target our image processor and say that, no, it is not your time to shine. Just do stuff for me in the background. So we're going to say display none. So what this means is it's still on the page, but it's taking no physical space. As a side note, there's another CSS thing that we can attribute called visibility hidden. What this will do is it'll basically effectually set the opacity to 0, but it still takes up all the same space that it had before. So we don't want to use visibility hidden because it's still occupying space on the page. It's just like Harry Potter's invisibility cloak. He's still there. He's still taking space up, right? But you just can't see him. Instead, we want display none, which is the equivalent of Harry Potter teleporting somewhere else, and he's not even there, right? So display none. Okay. So if we go ahead and refresh our page, we should see no noticeable difference, right? We can't, when we scroll, there's nothing down there, right? Because we hit it. But in reality, our canvas is down there, right? So now we're going to go ahead and use that canvas and process our video. Okay, so take selfie. We tap on the button, take selfie executes. Let's go ahead and grab our video stream and convert it. So the very first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to access our video. So we should probably create a new variable at the top called, what did we call it? We called it our image processor. So image processor, document. We're going to do the same old thing again. Get element by ID, and then, oops, image processor, right? So now we have access to our image processor canvas from JavaScript. Okay, once we've done that, we're now ready to do some cool things. Okay, take selfie button is clicked. We can access our image processor. And what we want to do now is we want to set a context. In the canvas, a context is a way of painting pixels. The way we're going to paint our pixel is in 2D, because we don't have any weird WebGL 3D accelerated graphics or whatever for games. So we're going to say get context, and we're going to get the 2D context. Okay? This returns an object that we can then use to paint stuff to our canvas, which is invisible. So now var context is going to be equal to that 2D context, right?
You know context?
Oh, sorry. Get context. Thank you for pointing that out. So now that we have our context defined, we can use, let's think to ourselves here, we get a context, context dot, we want to basically read in the image, right? So there's this handy function in the context called draw image. Okay, so what it does is it's going to do basically a double for loop, and it's going to iterate through every single little piece of our thing, and then just paste it and transform it onto the canvas. So we have a couple options here. So we're going to go draw image. The first thing is it accepts a source. Okay, the beautiful thing about accepting a source is these wonderful W3C people basically thought about everything, and they're like, yes, we can give it a raw image, or we can give it blah, blah, blah. We can give it a video element. And then it's going to magically figure out how to get video from the video element. How cool is that? We do no maths. Okay? So we draw an image. We take in a source. The source is going to be, guess what? It's going to be our selfie cam, right? Because that is our video element. And then we have to specify a couple different parameters. The first parameter is going to be the x direction in which the image is going to be offset. So it has some built-in transformation tools. Like, I think the easiest way is probably just to show you the picture that they drew out in the documentation itself. So again, documentation is awesome. All right. So we go to the context, draw image, and if we look at it, guess what? There's this handy-dandy little map that they have. It says the source image, right, takes in an image, which can be an HTML. I know that's really hard to see for you guys, so I'm going to blow it up a little bit. It takes in an HTML video element, which is what we have, right, our video tag. And if we look at the source, it basically has a change in y and change in x to offset it, and then it has a x and y width and height property for the image. So what happens if we have a small image and we try to draw it on a very large canvas? It's going to stretch the image, right? So with that information, we now know we want it to be at the top left. We don't want it to be offset by anything. And we want the width and the height to be what, right? Most cameras are 640 by 480. We can go ahead and maybe read the value, the x and y coordinate, the height and width coordinates, or height and width values of our video. But for now, we're just going to say 640 by 480. Because we can always improve this code later, right? So we're going to draw an image to our canvas that we cannot see, and it's going to be 640 by 480, and it's going to be coming from the selfie cam. So the reason that we need canvas to data HTML, to data URL, sorry, is we have the image drawn on our canvas, but we need to convert it into something that we can use for a picture. And the way that we do that is to data URL. So just like with the video, we created a URL for the stream, we're doing the same thing for the canvas. So to data URL, we're going to go ahead and pass in the var image URL. And we can now create an image with JavaScript and put it on the page somewhere. Okay, so we're going to start looking at how to create nodes in JavaScript, the raw way, without jQuery. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to say var img, which is the image we're going to create, is going to be document.create element. And the element that we're going to create is an img. You know, no surprises there. So this is going to create a new empty img element that looks like this. Okay? Once we create that, we want to modify some of its properties. The biggest one is the src, the source property, right? So image.set attribute, and the attribute that we want to set is src, the source, and the value is going to be the image URL, right? Now we want to append it to something on the page so it will show up, right? So let's look at our index.html for a second. We have a selfie cam, we have a take selfie button, and an image processor. Maybe we should add another thing in there to contain all of our selfies. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a div, and we're going to call this selfies. And this is just going to be a little pocket that's going to contain all of our selfies, okay? So you know the drill by now, right? We're going to go to main.js, and at the very top, we're going to go ahead and create a selfies variable, and we're going to go ahead and get element by ID selfies. So now we can access that. So right now we have take selfie, and we create an image, right? We set the URL attribute, or the source attribute, to the image URL, and then now, since we have supposedly have our selfies thing, we can just go ahead and say selfies dot add child, or we can append child, right? It's append child, and we're going to give it the img that we just created. So it's going to add that to our selfies divider, right? So the gentleman in the back was very astute, and he pointed out the fact that all of our variables right now are inside this startup function. And so he was right. He was like, well, how do you access them in here? And the reason is I lied, and you really cannot. So if we go into our page and we refresh, and we look at our source, let's go to our inspector here, go to our console, we press the button, and now it says image processor is not defined. And the gentleman was right. It's not defined because startup, everything exists inside startup right now, and is not available to our take selfie function. The reason for this is in JavaScript, when you call a function, everything that, all the variables and things like that, the context is of the function that called the function. So none of this is available outside, okay? So we want a way of maybe referencing these things outside and then bringing them back in when we need to use them. So one thing that we can do is we could create one function and then stick everything inside that function, and then, oh, you would be able to access it, right? Another issue with the code that we have right now is that we have a take selfie function, a startup function, and then we have this window event that's sitting out here. So if we had, let's say, 40 more files, we make this a very elaborate photo booth clone, and we have filters and all these things that we can do with it, and we have 40-some files. Each file can be adding functions directly to the global scope. Right now, this startup method is actually global. It's available everywhere. So we can use it wherever we want. And this is a very bad practice, right? So what we really want to do is we want a way of encapsulating these methods so that they're not available anywhere else, so that I cannot mistakenly create another startup function somewhere else that overrides this one. So the way that we can do this, or one of the many ways that we can do this, is we can create something called an IIFE. So it's an immediately invoked function executable, IIFE. It's very affectionately called IIFE for web developers. Okay, immediately invoked function executable. What this means is that we can go and we can wrap everything that we want in this format. So I'm going to do it with a small function first before I encapsulate the whole thing. So normally you have a function with some name, right? Func. And then you can call the function like this, right? So this will call the func method. Instead, what we want is we want to define some method here and call it immediately without doing this nonsense, without having two things happening at once. So the way that we can do that is we can create, because of the way JavaScript evaluates things, we can do function everything inside these opening and closing parens are considered to be an expression. So immediately evoke function expression. Sorry, I said executable. I always trip those things up. This becomes basically like a one-liner. It's kind of like saying alert, hi, or something like that. It automatically executes, right? So the same thing, this function now becomes an expression that you can immediately invoke, which is calling it immediately. So this part here, these two opening and closing parens, is kind of like saying alert, opening, closing parens, right? This is the expression, and then this is the function part, right? Okay. So inside of this will, whatever we put inside of here will immediately get called the moment it runs, the moment it hits this in JavaScript. And if I put a variable Tom, and I say Tom here, it's going to be undefined. So everything that I put inside of this gets sandboxed and is not available anywhere else. Okay? So we're going to do the same thing with our startup in our take selfie function. So we start off with a function. And inside of that, we're going to just grab all of this stuff, and we're going to stick it in there. It's like putting it in a little bit of a prison cell, right? So it can't do anything silly. Okay? And we're just going to have that at the top. We're going to delete all this stuff. And now we have a function that runs immediately, and it's completely sandboxed from the rest of the world. So if I create another file and I try to call startup, it'll say undefined, right? Again, all I did was I did a function at the top with an opening paren, and at the very bottom a closing paren, and then I'm calling it like a function immediately. Immediately invoked function expression. Okay, so to convince ourselves that this still works the same way that it did before, if we go back to our selfie demo and we refresh, we click the button, it'll still fail, but it's failing exactly the same way that it did before, right? There's no functional change. Now the beauty of this is, now that we've created a little sandbox island, we can put other things, we can pollute the island with things, and it's not going to affect anything else in the ecosystem, right? At least that's what we hope. So up here at the top, we can start sticking in some variables. We can say var selfie cam. We can say take selfie button, image processor. We're just defining a bunch of variables here, selfies, at the very top, right? So we're creating them at the top. And instead of having a var at the front to initiate a new variable, we can just get rid of that. And now all of these are actually being referenced above the startup function. And actually, I want to indent this so it makes a little bit more sense there. There we go. Right? So again, the iffy has everything in it. And inside of that, we have the selfie cam, take selfie button, and then once startup happens, it actually sets it to something, right? So once it sets it to something, you know the beautiful thing about this is, in our startup function, we have the event listener for take selfie. So if it hasn't finished loading for some reason, we cannot possibly click on the take selfie button and get an error, because the event only happens after startup is called, right? We only add the listener after startup. So even if the variables are declared out here, it's okay. Okay, so now inside take selfie, we have access to selfies and image processor and all these other cool things, right? So we save that, we go back and we refresh, and we click on the button, and whoa, there's an image there, guys. You see it? Now, something funky is going on with it, but we actually have an image showing up. It's pretty cool, right? Yay! So, okay, let's improve this a little bit and make sure our images are actually rendering correctly, and why they're not right now. So, if you noticed, we defined the draw image region to 640 by 480, right? Now, the problem with this is, our context, sure, is drawing at 640 by 480, but what is the size of our canvas? This is like a game of everything being relative to each other. Now, our canvas right now is actually not set to anything. So it's going to be the default resolution or default size, however large that might be. So what we really want to do is we want to make sure the canvas is exactly 640 by 480 first. And then when we draw the image on that canvas, it'll also be 640 by 480, so it takes up the entire space. And then when we say draw image, right, to the context, the entire canvas will be filled with that image. And then when we get the data URL, it'll be of the image in the canvas, which is now the correct size. So all we need to do here is we need to set the width and height of the canvas. So we don't really want to do that in take selfie. That doesn't really make sense. We want to do this inside startup, right, when we're initializing everything. So inside of our startup function, up here is a good place to do that. We can go ahead and say the image processor.width is equal to 640. I'm just hard coding these. It's not best practice, but I'm just doing that for the sake of the demo. Image processor.height is going to be 480. And we're going to save that. So now our image processor is forced to be at those dimensions. Okay, so we set the image processor, which is the canvas, and we set the context as well. So now when we refresh, and oops, wrong one, press the button, we should get a full-sized image. It's perfect, right? Cool. Now these are kind of large for my tastes. I want them to be a little bit smaller, more thumb strip or whatever they're called, thumbnail sized, right? So we're going to go ahead and squish those down a little bit. The good news is we did all the hard work already. So all we need to do is go to our style.css. Remember we called it selfies, right? We're going to grab all the images inside the selfies and set the width to 100 pixels. So it forces the width to 100 pixels. And we'll automatically let it scale the height so it doesn't look squished, okay? And now when we refresh it we have exactly 100 pixel wide images, right? And we can do some fun stuff. We can add margin right, 5 pixels or something like that. And now there's a 5 pixel margin between the images. Pretty cool, right? So now we've created a basic selfie thing. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Pretty cool, right? So we're just going to do a couple more things, and then we're going to show you the full demo, like after a little bit more time than the 2 hours that we have, right? So we maybe want to delete some of the selfies after they've been taken because they just suck. So that's the first thing we're going to try to do. So we're going to go back into our index or into our main.js. We're going to create a new function called delete selfie. And inside delete selfie, we want to maybe pass in a couple things. We want to pass in perhaps the selfie that's we're deleting, right? So the maybe data URL, which is the image, right, URL format. And then maybe we also want to pass in the image element itself. By that I mean the actual HTML element to remove from the DOM, right? Because we have two concepts. We have a data URL that's being generated for the image. It's a resource that's existing in memory somewhere. And then we have the DOM element that just renders that resource onto the image, right? So those are two different concepts. So we have the data URL and we have the actual image element, okay? So we take those two things in. For the image removal, we can just say image.parent node. The parent node is going to be just the selfies container, right? Which is the selfies container here. But this is a little fragile because we could change that in the future, right? Even this is selfies container, which is the parent. So instead of that, we're just going to use selfies dot remove child img, and that'll delete it from the DOM. That'll remove it from the DOM. The problem with this is, and you guys have all taken 1331 or 1301? Okay, so you might be familiar with the idea of garbage collection, in which case the runtime is able to dynamically allocate resources and remove things that are no longer being used and stuff like that. So We're not really doing that here, but what we are doing is we're making sure we clean up after ourselves after we created all these images. If we just remove the image element from the DOM, if we remove the image element from the DOM, it's like removing the window, okay? We're removing a window and we're putting a wall behind it. The world outside is still there, right? If you're in a jail cell and you're looking out and then there's like this tree that you like to see and there are birds on the tree, and then some mean guy like boards up the window, the tree and the birds are still there. You just can't see them anymore. So when we do this and we remove the child and we remove the image, we're just removing the window. The tree is still in the background, right? It's still lurking there somewhere. So we need to also remove that. So the way that we do that is, where does this exist, right? So if you remember before, we used the window.url thing to create the object URL right up here, window.url.createObjectURL. We can use the same singleton URL to also remove that. So to tell Chrome that we're not referencing this anymore, and you can go ahead and remove it from memory. So if we go to our trusty documentation and we do JavaScript URL, you can see there is a create and then there's this revoke. All right, and if we look at the documentation for revoke, it says the revoked method releases an existing object URL which was previously created by the create object URL. Beautiful, that's exactly what we want, right? So once you're done with the object, let the browser know that it doesn't need to keep the reference file any longer. So it just removes it. So no more memory hogs, right? So we're going to go ahead and use that here. Okay, so we're going to do window.url.revoke object URL, and we're going to pass in the image URL that we're bringing into this method, right? Okay, so theoretically delete should work. Delete selfie should work. Let's wire it up to an actual event so we can try it out. So for the sake of this demo, we're just going to say when we click on the image, we're not going to actually show you the image. We're just going to delete the image, okay? So we're going to cheat a little bit. So when I click on the image, I need to what? I need to probably add an event listener, right? So what do we have right now? We have a click event on the take selfie button. So maybe we should just add another one right below it for the image, right? But let's think to ourselves a little bit more. The images aren't being created in startup. Startup doesn't know about these images because none of them exist by default, right? At the beginning. So really, we can't do it there because it only happens once at the very beginning and there are no images. So we're going to keep looking down and say, okay, we take a selfie. After we take a selfie, we create the image tag. So we have reference to that image, right? We know about the image and we know about the URL, the image URL. So maybe we can add an event listener in take selfie to create the listener after it creates the image. And then let the delete selfie delete itself after it's executed, okay? So we stroke our chins for a moment, and then we go ahead and deliberately add another line. We're going to say, the image, right? Add event listener, click. And then we want to call what? Delete selfie. All right. So this is a cool little piece of JavaScript here because when we call delete selfie, what do we want to usually pass it? We usually want to pass it a reference, right? We pass it a reference to a function so that when this add event listener happens, when it's called, it'll basically say delete selfie and then it'll add the two open closing parens to actually call the function, right? To illustrate this, I'm going to put in alert deleted, and then we're going to put in the image URL here. Okay, so when we click on that selfie to delete, we should see the image and image URL, right? But should we? Let's try it out and see what happens. Okay, so we refresh. Oops, 46. Thank you very much. Okay, we refresh, and we press the take selfie button. It creates a selfie. Let's create another one. 4, 3, and now when we delete one, we should have like the data URL on the image. We click on it and it says deleted undefined. And we're like, why is that undefined? Why? I obviously just passed, like I have it specified in the params and everything, right? So we look at this again. The thing is, it's going to call delete selfie and it's going to put the two parens like this, like I said before. Now what's missing? The parameters are missing, right? So the parameters that we would have to pass is ideally we would say delete selfie, and then I pass it what? The image that we're currently creating, and then the where is it? Image URL, right? Which is the resource. So ideally we want to say delete selfie with those parameters. But what happens if I call it like this? So we're saving it. Oh, I'm calling it with those parameters now, right? So we go in, we refresh the browser. We press it, and it says deleted data image URL, and it has this giant string. Okay, I click OK. It's like I press that. Okay, and it immediately disappears. Like what just happened, right? Is that what we wanted? Because we're saying we're waiting for a click, right? Did I click this? I click on this dialog, and it just pops up immediately. That's not what we want either. So the trick is, what we really want to do is we want to call a function that exists in a different closure. So what we want to do is we want to create a function that will return another function, okay? So we're calling delete selfie with these parameters, but delete selfie itself is a method that returns another function. And this other function will be the code that actually deletes the image with that image URL. So this might not make a lot of sense right now, but we're going to clarify that, and it's going to be clear as mud in a couple seconds. Okay. So delete selfie. I have an image and I have an image URL. I'm going to go ahead and return, because you can return things in JavaScript, something that we haven't shown in this talk. We can go ahead and return another function. So remember how when we call a function inside a function, like we did with this iffy here, right? Variables that exist up here are available in here, right? So if that's the case, this image and image URL is available inside of this function, right? So inside of this function, we should be able to say selfies.removeChild and window.url. We should be able to put that in here. Whoops. And this should access these parameters, which we're specifying inside delete selfie. So let's think of it from the point of the browser. We create a selfie, right? We take a picture, and we take another picture, and we take another picture, so we have like 3 pictures. And then each time it creates a picture, it generates it, it puts it on the page, and then it adds this event listener to that particular click event for that image, right, that we just created. So when we call delete selfie with that image and that image URL, what it's doing is it's passing that image and that URL and immediately returning a function to add event listener. So you create 2 images on the page. It has 2 event listeners attached. But in both instances, the image and image URL parameters are different, right? It actually, because of the way JavaScript works with closures, it's actually remembering those values in memory, even though they're in completely different contexts. So when we call delete selfie, we are actually basically saying, like, return a function that has the correct image and image URL, and then when you click on it, it's gonna basically see it has this function, and it's gonna call this function here. And inside that function, it's gonna say selfies.removeChild image. And what is this image? This image was the image that you passed to it at the moment you called it initially. So when we save this, and we go back and we refresh, we create our pictures, right? It's not giving us that weird alert message anymore. And when we click on an image, it removes. So I'm going to do 5, 4, 3, and then 0. And if I remove the 4, you can see that 5, 3, 0 are still there. If I remove 3, it's 5 and 0, and I remove that and remove that, right? So that clears it up for us. So now we've deleted the selfie, and we've taken the selfie. So that's about all the time we have right now, but I want to show you the kind of bigger demo that I prepared for preparing for this one. So right now. Okay, so allow. And so you see it has the video, it has a little take picture button, and when you click on it, it actually will flash like a camera does. And the little pictures will drop down, right? And when you take another picture, when you get to the end, it actually scrolls to the latest and greatest picture that you did. And if you hover over the pictures, you can actually delete them, and it has like this little animation effect for deleting the pictures. And you can also save them to your disk. So if you press the save button, you can download the Polaroid to your desktop, and then when you open it up, yay, picture, right? So this is just with a little bit more, playing around with it. You can use the API however you want. It's very open-ended. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'll be here until 8. So thanks.